Achi, can you tell us a little bit about your family? I know you came from Holland.
Yeah.
But a little bit about your parents and where you grew up.
No problem. Well, now?
Yeah, please.
Oh, right. Have you taken a pic?
It's a video. We're doing...
Oh, crikey.
No, it's wonderful. So you can speak whatever you want to say.
See. Well, my name is Joachim Rudolf Frank. That's a full name. And I was born in Holland in 1938. My father was a general practitioner by profession, and he was called up for the army, mobilized in 1940. I last saw him in February 1940. We stayed on during the German occupation, and my mother and I went into hiding in the south of Holland in a place called Schaik, having been born in Os, which is quite near it in the south of Holland. We spent 18 months in hiding, first of all with a forester, and after a couple of months we were moved to a farm in the village, and we were liberated in September 1944.
Can I ask, Achi, were you an only child?
I am an only child, and my parents had been married, were married in 1935. My mother, Betty Meyer, is German Jewish. My father, Rudolf Frank, was Dutch Jewish, and he crossed over in 1940, May 1940, with the remnants of the Dutch army to England, served in England, was loaned to the British Army as a medical officer, and he was stationed in Colombo, in Ceylon, and did these convoys between Colombo and Melbourne. On the return trip, the third time, a ship was torpedoed, and unfortunately there were no survivors. My mother and I survived the war. After the liberation...
Can I just ask you, Achi, during the war, when you were in hiding, who hid you?
We were hidden by, first of all, by a forester called Welbers, in the middle of a forest. It was very lonely, and it was a safe place for hiding. The only thing was, whenever there was a raid, we went into the forest, into a tent, and spent the night there. We did about 3 months of that, and then we were moved to a farm, a farming couple, Richard and Nella Arts. They were very kind, very good to us. We lived with them, and my mother and I had a bedroom in the front of the house. There was also a hay loft where there were a couple of other people hiding. One was a Jewish man from the north of Holland called Alex Mock. The other one was a Catholic priest, and they were in the hay loft, and they listened to Radio Orange, so we kept up with news. Radio Orange being the Dutch radio station in London. We kept up with the news. We lived safely. We were discovered by a solitary collaborator soldier, but the people concerned made sure that he did not live to tell the tale. After that, we carried on, and for our mother, of course, it was frightening. One day she was doing the beds, and a German patrol passed, and she looked out of the window and they said, "Good morning" in German, "Guten Morgen," and she answered them spontaneously in German. It was a natural sort of feeling. And they spoke to her, and they told her she spoke a good German, and she said, well, she was in domestic service, so they walked off. And we were liberated by the Canadian American forces, and well,
do you remember the dates?
That was on the 17th of September 1944, and at lunchtime the column stopped, and there was a small part of the Free Dutch apparently involved in the column as well, in a tank or troop carrier, and it was pointed out to them that there were some Jewish people watching this procession along the highway, and of course the Free Dutch were very interested in it, and the man who was nearest to us was called Rodriguez Pereira. He was the rabbi chaplain of the Jewish part of the Free Dutch. They were so happy, so pleased to see survivors, and he put me on his shoulders, walked me around. They gave me a slab of chocolate, which was probably taken away from me and shared. Rodriguez Pereira later became chief rabbi of Holland, and I was the first Jewish child he'd seen during the liberation.
Aki, can I ask, when you were in hiding, did you have enough food, or did you always go hungry?
We were very, very fortunate, whereas many people didn't have enough food. We were on a farm, on a prosperous farm. The farmer was prosperous, and there was food. There was no problem with food. So, unlike other people, we had no food problems. Unlike when we stayed with the forester, where things were tricky. But once on the farm, we were well looked after, and they did their own manufacturing. They made butter. They had calves, which they butchered, etc. While we were staying with the forester, food was sparse, and my mother had to fall in with whatever came along in food, but later on she was in a different position.
Do you remember the name of the forester?
Pardon?
Do you remember the name of the forester?
Of the forester, yes, it was Willem Welbers. He had a daughter who he was a widower with a daughter and a couple of sons, and they tried their best. We also remained friendly with them after the war. In fact, we went to the daughter's wedding in 1947, and the farmer, we were far more friendly when after we emigrated to South Africa in 1951. We always remained in touch. And
what was the name of the farmer?
The farmer was Richard Arts, and his wife was Nella Art Smith, and we, as I said, we remained in touch. We brought her out for a visit to South Africa in 1957. The farmer wouldn't leave the farm. Couldn't leave the farm, or wouldn't leave the farm. He never left the village, but she came to visit us. We took her around, and she also attended my wedding in 1971 when we brought her out again. And we put her on the main table. She didn't understand a word of the speeches, but she loved every minute of it.
And Aki, can I ask, these two families, the farmer and the forester, were they given righteous amongst the nations? At Yad Vashem, were they recognized as righteous amongst the nations?
Yes, they are both up on the Yad Vashem memorial thing. We saw to that.
Because they endangered their lives to save you.
We saw to that in due course. After the war, September 44, we stayed until January 45 on the farm because they continued fighting. Then we returned to Os, to our home there, and my mother re-established my father's practice with a locum. In fact, this locum she had when my father went into the army, and she was also in hiding with us in the same village at a different address. Her name was Margaret Danby, and she came back with us and recommenced the practice, which after my father was declared dead in 1948, my mother sold the practice, and we in due course immigrated to South Africa.
Can I ask you, Achi, when you came back to Ost, did you go back to your original home?
Yes, no, not initially. Initially, because we had a very large house which was used by the Germans as their headquarters, and when the Germans were removed, the Allies used it as their headquarters. So we lived in a house down the road which belonged to a collaborator who'd been arrested for about 8 or 9 months, after which we moved back to our house. And, we re-established the house, the family residence, etc., until we left.
And in your town, in Ost, was there any synagogue or anything, anything Jewish?
There was a synagogue. My grandfather took me to shul regularly, and there was a community as such, and later on the community increased in size, and they built a new synagogue, but unfortunately a friend of mine who remained in the city and became chairman of the congregation, unfortunately he had to close down the community in the early 2000s because of the dwindling numbers.
And Achi, out of your family, who survived out of your extended family?
Out of my family, my father was in the war, killed in the war. His sister, Achi Frank, was taken by the Germans off the street in 1943, and she was sent to Westerbork camp first, and then to Sobibor, where she was murdered. And my father's brother survived the war in hiding in the south of Holland with his parents. And the sad thing is that my grandparents lost 2 of their 3 children in the war.
And your grandparents survived as well?
My grandparents survived as well. My grandfather dying in 1959.
How did they survive, your grandparents?
They were in hiding in a place called Brunsum in Limburg in the south of Holland. And they survived, and they remained there and returned to their home in Amsterdam in 1945.
And Achi, what made your mother decide to immigrate to South Africa?
Sorry?
Why did your mother decide to immigrate to South Africa?
For a very simple reason. In 1948, my mother's brother, who had immigrated from Germany to South Africa in 1936 to escape the Nazis, 1948 came for a visit, and he said, "What are you doing here? It looks like another world war." This was when the Cold War with the Russians was on. Looks like another world war, and you've been looking after our parents, my grandmother having died in the meantime. All this while, he suggested that she and his father, who lived with us, my grandfather and I, should come to South Africa. And there was very little to keep my mother in Holland at the time, so we emigrated. For safety reasons, we did one of them.
And you went, when you came to South Africa, did you go straight to Johannesburg?
We went straight to Johannesburg, and my mother subsequently remarried, and I went to school in my Krugersdorp High School, where I matriculated because my mother and stepfather lived in Florida on the West Rand.
But you could understand Afrikaans, knowing Dutch.
Yeah.
And you went to Wits University?
I went to Wits University.
And you got your speciality?
And I went to Wits University, qualified in medicine, after which I specialized in obstetrics and gynecology, and spent the next 40 years in practice.
And then you eventually came to London.
And then when I retired, I found that my son was in London with his family. He moved to London. He's an actuary. And our daughter is in New York. She's an architect. And there was very little to hold us, to keep us in South Africa. And we wanted to see our children. Our daughter comes over regularly from New York.
And Achi, during all this time, did you keep your emunah? Did you always kept your Jewish tradition? You
always kept the traditions. My wife, who is a little more orthodox than I am, doesn't let up on anything, and we always kept our traditions. And our son is Shomri, and our daughter possibly a little less so. Right.
And Achi, if I had to ask you, what message do you impart to the next generation, to your children and to the next generation?
Well, to the next generation, the message is that one's got to be aware of one's surroundings, or the politics of those surroundings, of the way of life you wish to have. Education is the most important thing, and also to stick to one's religious background and to remain part of the religious grouping as far as possible.
So Achi, I just want to come in to thank you.
Now who's this going to?
I do it voluntary. But Achi, I just want to thank you so much. This has been for me the greatest honor and privilege, and I've known you for so many years in South Africa, in the philatelic world, and here we're meeting in London at the International Stamp Exhibition, and it's really been such a privilege and honor to eventually hear your story. I always knew you were a survivor, and now we've actually managed to hear your incredible story. Thank God that there were people that really were prepared to risk their lives to save.
Absolutely.
It's something that is we so admirable. It's something.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Yeah, just as a footnote, my mother went back to Holland in 1982 to visit a farmer and his wife. She hadn't been back, and he was very ill with a malignant disease, and he hung on more or less. He died a couple of days after she'd been to visit him.
And she saw him?
She saw him.
It must have been very emotional.
Last chat. And I remember when I was in Holland, first time on a visit in 1966, he and I were having a quiet chat, watching the Holland-Belgium football match and having a pint of beer, and I said, look, what made you take this risk? It wasn't the money. What made you take this risk? He said, look, I'm a farmer. During the Depression in the 1930s, 1932, 33, we suffered and battled on the farms, and the Jewish cattle traders were always very good to us. That was the first reason. The second reason was you cannot let good people be prosecuted simply for their religion.
It's amazing.
And the third reason was he never liked the Germans anyway.
Wow. It's a miracle. It really is a miracle.
Richard Arts was a very, very honorable man, and he was not educated, but he read the Catholic Weekly every week, and he never missed out on it.
Well, Achi, you should just have mazel and bracha at Mayvest Room to 120 in good health, and thank you so very much.
Just a pleasure. Nice seeing you too, Les.
It's really been such an honor and a privilege. Achi, I'm so grateful
All of a
to you.
sudden.
It's really wonderful.
Stamp exhibition.
Thank you.